Good evening, dear friends. Welcome, Bilgehan.
Greetings, everyone. We are together again. I was looking forward to seeing you all.
Indeed, this work feeds us with rich impressions. And with your questions and comments, you motivate use to study harder for finding better ways of explaining the concepts and topics in this reading and commentary series of the divine order and the universe.
Actually, this book is not about some great unknowns. People cannot notice at first that this book actually explains the development of humankind, that is, humankind's development over matter from the perspective of the spirit. They cannot notice at first that this book mentions particle physics or quantum physics, or the time comprehension this book mentions is closely related to relativity, etc. Because of this, many people assume at first that this book is all about some super magical things or incomprehensible realms, yet as we spend some efforts to understand, it becomes obvious for all of us that the concepts of this book are not too complicated but rather clear, that all of this knowledge has been expressed for us, that the whole book is not only a handful of super intelligent people but it is meant to be understood by everyone. Still, we need to spend efforts to study and understand. If you read this book as it is a novella, you may not get anything from it.
I think that's the reason for some disappointments I observe in some people. During the 54 years this book has been kept in the safe of a notary, a fantastic expectation grew as though when this book is disclosed humankind would read it and there would be a mass awakening. However, we see that no comprehension or awakening may occur unless we spend efforts and super efforts in the midst of this world matter. And, after all, the awakenings we can talk about can only occur within the current material conditions we live in. Personally, for me the most striking point of this book is the placement of spirits outside of universe, describing spirits as supra-universe truths. And also, there was a tendency, especially in spiritual circles, for rejecting the body or whatever that is deemed matter and worldly. With this book's disclosure, we are trying to replace that tendency with the need of giving matter its due at its deepest levels, and also, with the need of completing this school properly. Otherwise, it is not so easy to get out of the cycle of, or the wheel of incarnations. I think that this book changed our perspective a lot.
Yes, you are right. Years ago, I was assuming that the spiritual matters cannot be reconciled with knowledge about physical world. This is one thing and that is another thing. That science and spiritualism should not be discussed together because they are not the same, etc., etc. This was my thinking back then. And in 2013, The Divine Order in the Universe is published and the first sentence of this book was about matter, and this cracked my mental walls and shells and rigid thinking, and that was so good because then, I began to unite these two concepts in my mind, as best as I can. After all, our purpose is to make this great duality into a unitary.
Had not been all those cracks, breakings, changes in our shells or walls, we would remain clinging to our previous thinking, and it would turn into belief. And we now know that comprehension gets wider by comparing what we learn, and by discerning what is beneficial for our development, and filtering out what is not beneficial. Yes, let's start reading. Interventions of the beings in duty, which grew clear in the world towards current times, and put into effect great religious institutions, and many other communal situations, have not been seen as so clear and encompassing in the world's initial cycle of mankind. For in initial cycles, within their still developing comprehension, mankind was not in need of such major communal evolution. Mankind, whose comprehension was still at the stage of automatic intuition, was mostly leading individual lives. And some small communities that occurred in the meantime were completely different from the great communal concepts as currently understood. Transitory communities of those times occurred under the needs arising out of a few very simple instinctual intuitions, such as worry over starvation, the instinct of fear, sexual needs, etc. In these simple developmental stages, the comprehensive communal lives of mankind were not established yet. And this was a consequence of lacking the enabling power of their comprehension to put into effect such a situation. That is, powers of gathering, establishing, and administering, which are necessary in sufficient degrees to gather individuals and to establish common activities towards a certain goal, and to conduct them, had not yet occurred in their comprehensions. Because of this, these first humans whose level of equilibrium of their conscience duality was always set on the plane of the earthly cravings, were confined to the lower realities for most of the time. 4. The first humans who had just started to separate from the automatic advance in the stages of subhuman, did not yet possess the possibilities of direct intervention to their bodies with their comprehension which they would acquire in future through a wider scope of freedom. If the case had continued like this, it would not have been possible for them to rise to higher stages of developmental equilibrium levels by themselves. Because of this, in order to ensure their ability to elevate the equilibrium levels of initial developments, the necessity and imperativeness of the individual interventions coming from outside into the comprehension of mankind had to continue for a while. Naturally, as comprehension developed, that is, as they widened their scopes through refining experiences in the human state, external interventions rather headed towards the side of increasing the possibilities of comprehension for their intervening developmental mechanisms by themselves.
This book tells us about how the human beings gradually begin to take the wheel, so to speak, or to gradually take his or her existential responsibility as this agency is gradually given to humans. And of course, up to a certain degree, and in ratio of our relation to matter, the scope or extent of our comprehension, our degree of mastering matter. I mean, if we humans reach this current state of talking easily about our feelings and emotions, or if we humans establish societies or non-profit organizations all over the world through the motivation of subtle states and altruistic feelings, and volunteer to work for the betterment of the conditions of individuals or communities, then we can see these as pointers to humans' gradual but ongoing state of taking their own existential responsibility, their gradual development. And most of such societies and non-profit organizations are the fertile grounds of applications for weakening the hold of earthly cravings, such as money and egoism, and of applications for strengthening the mentality of we instead of mentality of me. I think, such altruistic group organizations may be the last appearances of the final levels of human stage we can display in this world, besides the heroic acts of some individuals that selflessly sacrificed their time, energy, and even life for the greater community of human beings. Why I consider such appearances as final examples? Because, as we read in this passage, let's say 70,000 years ago, or 60,000, 50,000, 40,000, 30,000 years ago, there were no need for such altruistic states. That is, life was completely individualistic, more correctly, was all about the survival of the body. Groupings and later small and relatively larger proto-communities appeared only around 20,000 years ago, yet self-centeredness still prevailed. The only purpose of a human being was to survive, to stay alive. I mean, the only subject pronoun of that time period is I. And the only purpose is to keep that I alive, that's all. Imagine that having a good sleep was almost an impossible luxury. Now, we can easily say, oh, I cannot wake up at 6 a.m., it is too early for me, but back then, in that initial period of human stage, even 10 minutes of sleep was luxury, because the finding food to eat and hiding from animals seeing you as food is a whole day problem. Hiding from predators, gathering food and getting short rests, even though these interests are basic and savage, were a luxury because humans were not able to make small groups, let alone communities. And of course, we cannot expect from a human at those times to work with subtle energies or to work on his or her feelings of jealousy, etc. Such higher tasks and sublime spiritual actions are not expected from them. After all, they didn't have such potential back then. And as beings, they don't have that degree of comprehension. The only potential of the human being of those times is to respond to these instinctual drives. This passage explains the state and the situation of those initial times. And of course, as time passes, humans had impressions and experiences with their own body in the external world. This accumulation of knowledge particles led to their comprehension widen enough to make and use tools. You may know, we mentioned many times in our previous videos that due to the needs of spirit, matter gets developed, and spirit evolves more and more as spirit utilizes ever-developing matter through the being it builds, and in this way, the being reaches at such a point in its development that the being begins mastering matter and start to direct its own development. The last sentences of this passage point to that stage. Naturally, as comprehension developed, that is, as they widened their scopes through refining experiences in the human state, external interventions rather headed towards the side of increasing the possibilities of comprehension for their intervening developmental mechanisms by themselves. In other words, by their own efforts and persistence, to direct and also elevate their development, plus, to comprehend that they are doing this. For example, right now, we know what we are engaged with, what we work on or with. We had passed through that state of complete automatism and unawareness, the states full of fear and survival instinct, and we are now at the state of studying the whole range of our thoughts and emotions. We now can detect our love and our jealousy. We now are able to spend very long time upon very fundamental and very subtle concepts and issues. And the development of matter helped us a lot in reaching this present state. I mean, back then with 10 minutes sleep we could do only that much, but matter got developed and we now have beds in a room. We may say that development of matter provided us with a new ground, with certain comforts which humankind managed to bring out by accumulated knowledge and by uniting the results of individual comprehensions. And due to this development of matter, we now have more time in our hands to sit down and think on why this or that thing happened to us, or schedule the things we will do next day, or lay on our bed without an ounce of sleep because our fears and anxieties about things to happen or not happen. And now, because we have more time on our hands to think, ponder and meditate on our problems, we are beginning to understand the mechanism working at the background of our fears. That is, development of matter benefits the spiritual evolution, or in other words, development is in service to evolution.
Each developmental stage is included and progressed by the next stage. What is emphasized here in this passage that human beings in that initial period of the human stage, or our ancestors we now see as savages or primitive, were actually very developed beings in comparison with the previous stages of the beings passed through until the human stage, which are plant and animal stages when the being got developed enough to start coordinating these bodies. And even in those so-called more primitive bodies, let's say, as the being learns to govern the realm of plants through the instincts, innumerable variations and differentiations occur among those myriad plant bodies. There are parapsychology experiments done with the various plants, and the researchers detected the electrical signals showing that plants can sense or perceive and respond to strong feelings like love and hate coming from humans, or respond to heavy metal and classic music. And we read that at the stage of animal, the exercise is done so these instincts gradually progress into intuitions. And in this passage, at this initial phase of the human stage, the humans get developed by the automatic intuitions. Remember the hierarchy of needs pyramid of Abraham Maslow? Survival level is at the bottom, the widest and largest level. Yes, as humans, we had spent a very long time in that area of the developmental pyramid, so we can be able to move up towards the next level. And as we move up, the time period we spend in the upper areas gets shorter. Because as humans observe and learn that things to do become much easier when these are done together with others, and consequently, As human group as tribes and communities, the time we spend on the levels of the developmental pyramid gets shorter and shorter. In other words, our development accelerates. And why this book so strongly emphasizes that initial phase of the human stage. If our dear friends remember, last week, we had read that many beings in duty were sent to the world by the divine systems to be rulers and guides to the human communities. And their way of living, ideas, revelations and teachings brought out great changes in those communities. And as you said, at this initial phase of the human stage, humans were not in that level yet. Eventually, as they gather in groups and make small communities, their comprehensions make more connections, and at the mystic level, they observe the sun and its cycles and sun's effect on nature. Consequently, they add meaning to sun's effects, and begin to see the sun as God. The steps humankind took in observing the nature and discovering it to have a greater power and order than humans had were the states that entailed breaking automatisms. And I think that is why these initial states are emphasized in this book.
You just mentioned how the comprehensions get developed. Yes, humans try things again and again and eventually understand how to do that thing, and consequently, get developed. However, the interesting point is, at the beginning of that initial stage humans don't know that whatever they try to do is for their comprehension's development. There is no awareness about this. So, this gradual passing from instincts to basic intuitions and to semi-comprehension but still in the midst of automatism. Here we are now, although there are still some automatisms for us, we are humans of the last cycle, humans that we know and that we work on what we know. And I guess that old state of ours, this twilight state of consciousness between deep sleep and awakening is now over. Well, I can say that if we are engaged and preoccupied with these concepts and subjects explained in this book, yes, it is over. Because, these are hard topics to be engaged with. We study ourself, our being, and actually, we begin to know what we know and what we don't know. Secondly, I'd like to give a nice example from nature and connect this to humans. There is an octopus living in the North Pacific Ocean. It is called giant Pacific octopus. A magnificent creature. Its lifespan is between 3 to 5 years. At the end of her life, the female octopus lays between 100,000 and 400,000 eggs and stops eating for around 6 months until her eggs have hatched. Just before her eggs hatch, she creates small waves around them to break the sacs of the growing larvae with the last ounce of energy left in her body. And when the eggs are hatched, the female octopus dies. And the first food of her hatchlings becomes the body of their mother. And only a few of those thousands of eggs manage to survive to become full-fledged octopuses. Female octopus does not know why she must protect her eggs, and then, why she must feed her hatchlings in this way. The self-sacrificing act of this animal is completely instinctual and automatic. And let me connect this example to our current human condition. When a human female reaches puberty, her body begins the monthly cycle of menstruation, and we assume she has enough comprehension to learn, to observe and to know she will become pregnant if her eggs are fertilized by the sperms of a human male. And, if she gives birth to a child, that human female can decide what to do with her newborn. I mean, as we see in some sad examples, a mother can even discard or abandon her newborn. Which female is more advanced? The female octopus that cannot move, in case one of her thousands of larvae may get lost? Or a human female that can discard or abandon her newborn? And please don't think emotionally and assume the octopus is full of love. Let me repeat. The self-sacrificing act of this animal is completely instinctual and automatic. Of course, the human is more advanced because humans are not automatic anymore, they already passed that phase of the human stage. That automatism is an old reality, a backward reality. And human is at a stage of learning how to do applications of love by the choices she or he makes with free will, and of course, by taking the responsibility of those choices, I mean, living the consequences of those choices. And this learning cannot be done by reading books, going to retreats in the mountains or hearing from gurus and teachers. No, this learning is to be acquired by direct application, by the first-hand experiences. Of course, many biological things begin automatically, but the rest of the relationship between human female and her child is mainly shaped by the mother's choices. I mean, the divine system does not lend some automatic loving and caring capacity to the human female. Yes, there are hormones related to this bonding between the mother and child, but still, the connection between the human female and her child gets shaped mainly by the choices made by the mother. Because of the example I started with, I talk about motherhood, but of course, we can multiply examples of these differences. With these examples, I wanted to underline the degree of the free will and comprehension of us humans at this point we reached in our development, and of course, the responsibility we have to take due to this freedom of choice. And moreover, we now know about this, we learned about our free will and our responsibility. Well, that gives us an extra responsibility.
These points, especially that point about responsibility you underlined, are so important. That octopus, at the level of its being, develops an existential muscle, even though it gets experienced automatically. Of course, there are efforts made by her, but the being of the female octopus does not observe the process. She does not comprehend the experience in the sense we know. She acts automatically, instinctually. On the other hand, the mother who discards or abandons her newborn or child, she also develops an existential muscle. And because of the fact that her degree of free will and responsibility is much greater than the female octopus, she has to live and experience the consequences of her decision or choice, that is, her action. Later she has to go through various applications of conscience mechanism, and these applications may continue in future lifetimes of that female, as well, because, by this action, she also brings out new cause and effect chains, or with the trendy way of saying, new karmic connections. In short, for female octopus, the laws of cause and effect does not work in the way it works for the human female. Yes, let's continue reading. We have already mentioned that self-intervention of comprehension at the beginning of the human life could only be possible through external interventions and assistance. In these initial cycles, everything is automatic and without comprehension. Because of this, mankind called this instinct. In early times, higher communal plans had always intervened over mankind. Here, however, expression of intervention should not be misunderstood. What is meant by intervention is giving a direction, organizing and programming. Interventions that have more extreme meanings than those are not for the stage of humanity. So, in early times, classical expression of these external vibrations in comprehension was via the instincts. These instincts should be considered separate from the heavier and cruder automatism existing in animals. 4. Between these two automatisms, there is a wide difference in disposition. Likewise, such differences also exist between the automatism in animals and in plants. As comprehension is refined, these instincts become richer in characters and enter into forms and states, which mankind calls intuition. The start of the cycle of intuition in the world has occurred more or less in equality in regard to general value. Voids and deficiencies that could not be filled by instincts have started to be filled gradually with the birth of intuitions. And the communal life in the world, which is the symmetry and preparation of communal plans in the higher realms, has thus been established. And during this establishment, parallel to the development of comprehension, and also as the results of this development, the need for secession of the whole into parts, fragmentations, organizings, and organizer has emerged. Because of this, as the dispositions, necessities, and imperatives increase, Similarities between bodies and similarities of instincts caused by the lack of content in comprehension, which is particular to the early cycles, have ceased to be, and different states put into effect by evolution have manifested in the bodies not as previous slight differences, but as wide value differences. From this social formations moment onward, individual and communal gatherings, again, in the most automatic sense in regard to human life, have started. Some individuals have led these communities in regard to various value measurements, such as selfish leadership, leadership at a stage of conscience, and leadership at cycles of major and general development that have arrived at certain times. It is this imperative that has made some of mankind acquire abilities of sensitive communication because of this. Strong mediums have come, some certain transitional stages occurred, and the plans of emotional preparation for duty have started through the intuitions of some knowledge, grasping and reaching towards the higher paths of the universe, and finally, towards the recent times of the past. These plans have taken their most developed states, and intuitions have manifested in communities in the form of more powerful symbols and reforms. In summarizing comprehension's development, as the lot of the world, briefly and generally, we have also given general knowledge on how and in what way the communities were constituted.
Well, we read here how the slight but fundamental differentiation occurs in the comprehensions of the beings. I mean, a person could think of something but I couldn't, or how a leader did shine in the eyes and the minds of a community and responded to the needs of the individuals and provided their advancement. The key to this is given in this passage. Of course, first we remember and never forget that reincarnation is only a tool or a means we utilize. We are aware of the fact that what has been written in this book is not about the limits of a single lifetime. No, this book is about the human stage. And human stage consists a period of births and deaths which is about 500 to 700 lifetimes for each human being. Here, at these initial states, humans are at the same level, yes, after completing the animal stage, at which survival instinct is the main drive, humans are still driven by the instincts, as well. And remember that instincts are the most primitive forms of comprehension. And, animal instincts are cruder in comparison with the more developed or subtler human instincts. So, gradually, humans, with each lifetime they are born to and die in, gain impressions and experiences, and this makes a ground for basic forms of intuitions emerge from. And one of these humans, or a few of them, tries a few things together and make a fire. Yet, this human or humans don't say or think that it is time to discover fire. In those initial states, the transformation of the automatism of the human instincts into intuitions were not that obvious. Humans did not know what they know, hence, they were not aware of many things and their mental processes. Still, gradually, and in somewhat very crude and very slow manner, humans learn to give an ear to their intuitions, and in a sense, they begin to experience their inner awareness. And because of these experiences, gradually initial discoveries and inventions of humankind, or in other words, the results of human mind's development over matter occur. And consequently, as humans gather to establish small and relatively large communities, we see the gradual emergence of thinking humans, the humans with ideas that suggest some rules or way of living to the others in their communities, that is, the leaders. Of course, we are not talking about philosophy or philosophers yet. These leaders, albeit in simple ways, will shape the actions and behaviors of the group or the community, and of course, compared to our current communal rules and norms, theirs were harsher, stricter, cruder but still perfectly suitable for the needs and the conditions of that time period. And in this way, intuition ally, humankind gradually learns to establish hierarchies that are the reflection or echoes of the higher plans by gathering as groups and communities, and the individual humans pointing the way or guide the group, even though unconsciously, begin to emerge as leaders as they come forth. And of course, such persons are not selfless. Their only aim is not to shoulder more work with each lifetime and not to always advance their community. No, of course, such persons have their own concerns, interests, egoism, sensuality, earthly cravings, and of course, they are born into lifetimes of suffering and hardship to de-escalate these sides of theirs. And this developmentary process continues like this. From a single human being to a small group of humans, then to small and large communities, then peoples, nations, an organization occurs with ever-widening way in humankind's life on Earth.
Each era has its own conditions, and each era functions in the development of beings and of matter, in widening their capacity. And this widening of capacity occurs through the guidance of the system, and as their capacity widens, the influence of the communication between the being and the guiding beings in duty increases, and as this influence intensifies, intuitions get activated in humans. If you remember, last week we had discussed the mechanism of inspiration. This was a state of communication between us and our spiritual guides and beings in duty. A state of communication that does not entail a trance from us humans, and this state occurs whenever we concentrate or orient or focus on towards searching for a solution to a problem. As you said, when humans begin to notice their inner states, they reach for more because they begin to notice the slight differences in their life when compared to their completely automatic states. Let's say you are a human that can compare these states, and as you try hard to feed yourself, you receive an influence, and it acts as an intuition, or gut feeling or inspiration in you, and you find ways of hunting better. Or you think a way of chipping a kind of stone to use it as a tool, hence, get out of the automatism of your previous states. And your example makes other humans observe and think. The rest is human history of questioning and thinking. As the human populations, and consequently, settlements, villages, towns, cities increase in numbers, various philosophical ideas, sociological ideas emerge as well. So, we see the ability of humans grow as they think, make connections, remember those connections, and utilize those connections individually and communally. Those dynamics push the development of the human being and the human societies further. In this passage, we read that yes, there were interventions made by the higher plans and beings in duty, but these are not interventions as we understand this term in our world. Just a nudge in the right direction, or like an invisible block preventing us to go further in a wrong path. Actually, in the divine system, according the needs of the time and the merit of the beings, sometimes a stone is pushed away from our path, and sometimes a stone is placed on our path. And both intervention leads us to have different but necessary experiences, by our decisions and choices we make in the face of that stone, either from the duty side or from the sensuality side of our conscience mechanism. Development and evolution progress in this way. Last week, in the passage we read, there was a sentence striking my attention each time I read this book. It is about the knowledge given to humankind. Have helped mankind in elevating the level of reality equilibrium line of their conscience mechanisms to the uppermost levels of their possibilities of comprehension, which are within the allowance of the necessities particular to that moment. Therefore, let's say you had an enlightenment, you discovered or invented something, and consequently you have reached a higher level at your development at that moment. But you don't stay there. Another event makes you make a decision or choice from the sensuality or earthly craving side of your duality unit. You come down. So, the important issue is to elevate and also keep the line of development at a certain level, not only for the individual but also for the communities as well. Throughout the known history of humankind, there has been leaders from both sides of the conscience mechanism, egoistical leaderships and altruistic leaderships. Humankind went through those periods and the tests and trials such periods entailed. Today, humankind is in the final test, because we are now at such a stage of our development that our test is all about our decisions and choices made with conscience. Not with automatism, not with divine interventions, etc., but making choices and decision with consciousness, with awareness, with comprehension, and also knowing where the consequences of such decisions and choices will lead us, and also enduring all consequences of those choices and decisions. Yes, this is a compelling state. Yet, it is like the toothpaste tube. Pressure is coming from both sides, and the toothpaste goes up and up, out of the tube. Or, to obtain water vapor you need to boil water. Only after a certain level of heat, water molecules become agitated, and water's liquid state transform to its gaseous state, and water molecules leave the surface of the boiling water and go up. Yes, I think these examples are apt, considering the social and economic pressures of our world, and the effects of global warming and ecological pollution on weather patterns and environment. I think, when they reach a certain degree, these will agitate us, as molecules of humankind, so much that we will leave the surface of crude matter, of our automatic ways that we are deeply identified with, and move up.
As we talk about human communities, I'd like to add that our location, state, and conditions within the society we live in are the best and most suitable ones for our development. We must understand this, even though it is not nice and easy to accept, especially if we live in big and crowded cities where the daily life is full of struggles. Yes, cities are such places, but still, please remember that at the existential level, this was the decision of our being because living in big cities would advance our development.
Yes, in a big metropolis, let's say, like Istanbul, each moment is a test and trial, traffic jams, finding a parking space, commuting in crowded buses and trains, living in crowded apartment blocks, etc. Still, in the sense of gaining more experience, we can experience more in a single day than the experiences we can gain during a week or a month we spent in a secluded area or a small town. Again, I'd like to remind our dear friends that phrase I just mentioned, the level of reality equilibrium line of their conscience mechanisms. So, neither that opposite nor this opposite, but the balance point in between these two sides. And we learn how to be in the center, or to be centered by swinging back and forth between these opposite sides of our duality mechanism. Yes, let's continue reading. Each of the communities in the world has occurred because of imperatives raised by preparation for the great plan of duty. It has been previously said that a man, as a single individual, could not make this preparation completely on his own. The knowledge we have just given has also taught that comprehension, when remaining alone, could not ensure intended developments. Mankind can never develop by living alone throughout the world. Races, nations, communities, societies, families that exist in the world are the consequences of the imperatives and needs explained above. Of these, first, let us take the races. According to the world's social, natural, and geographical conditions, certain differentiations and groupings in human structures and comprehensions have occurred through the approval and influence of sublime beings in duty, in accordance with necessities that have come filtered through the unitary, and in the main areas of the various formations, transformations, and deformations made by the comprehensions over their bodies, some common qualities and characteristics particular to certain groups were distinguished. Comprehensions gathered within such groups carry the somatic and psychic, both are one and the same, but are concepts belonging to various manifestations of the body peculiarities of that group, and they lead to the phenomenon of race. This knowledge indicates that mankind's separation into races is the consequence of their comprehension's indirect influence over their bodies. That is, differences in races are not comprehension's direct efficacy over the body, through the influences it receives from the being, but rather states raised out of the occurrence of changes over the body by influences coming from the surroundings and events in the surroundings. So, different races are the result of mankind's imperative, in accordance with their developmental needs, in having come down the world in this or that condition, and in having utilized those conditions this or that way. As two men from white and black races who came into the world with certain evolutionary needs display different characteristics with their skin color, likewise, they display, among the same people, again, according to the same necessities, more or less different psychic actions and reactions depending on their bodies. In short, white or black, yellow or red, all mankind aspires towards the same goal, shoulder to shoulder at the same path, by overcoming the same obstacles with the same difficulties. And this journey is for all. Monopoly or privilege for anyone is out of the question. Whatever kind of advance is necessary for the development of each being, it is an obligation for that being to follow that advancement. Today, the paths to be traveled are painted white. When necessary, they can be painted yellow, and again, if necessary, they can be painted black or red. Therefore, skin color, and any characteristics accompanying these colors, which cause racial segregation of mankind, do not have any value that may justify such segregation. These are simple materials in part of the transitory developmental vehicles that need to be used on the paths to be traveled, and the necessities of the imperative of the mass advancement on the path of preparing for the duty.
Well, about races, we already have some intuitions about the explanation given in the divine order and the universe. This biological material, this body of ours takes on various states in accordance with the geographical and external conditions, like heat, humidity, altitude etc., and as the body takes on these states, it also gains some physical, somatic and psychical properties, and of course, this process leads to some differentiations. And when a being needs to incarnate, the beings in duty and the being itself can choose among the most suitable body type for the experiences needed for that being in its next lifetime. Not because that body type and the being is backward or advanced, but because of the experiences needed for the life plan of a being. Again, this book explains these topics of body and races in terms of matter's ever-widening scope of development and being's level of ability to organize that scope of matter. And the different properties of human bodies are utilized for different developmentary phases and stages. Most probably, in the previous cycles of the world, the body types were much more different than our current ones, and each time, at the aftermath of the end of a cycle, some body types survive the global cataclysms, and they keep on becoming more different with the new conditions of the new cycle.
Well, throughout the divine order and the universe, we read how matter gets developed by formations, transformations, and deformations. That is, within our matter universe, in our hydrogen cosmos, matter does not vanish, but always turns into some other state of matter. It gains a form through these transformations, and that form is utilized by the being to gain experiences about the states that form exist in. And when the being is done with that form, matter dissolves into its basic or less formed states. We know from the studies and sessions we done in the regression therapy field, people recall memories from past lifetimes, that they lived in various body types and races. Let's say, a person recalls the memories from a lifetime as an American Indian, from a lifetime as an Africana lifetime in Atlantis, a lifetime in Ice Age as an Inuit, a lifetime as a slave and a lifetime as a slave driver. Combining this information with the knowledge about matter's development given in this book, I can say that body is a vehicle for the being, a vehicle it built and governed by the influences it sends to this biological vehicle. The being builds bodies as a plant, as an animal, and eventually as a human, to be born into a cruder matter milieu, that is our world, so the being can gain impressions and experiences through this vehicle. And when the being stops sending influences to this biological vehicle, the event what we call death happens. Now, when we also consider the innumerable migrations, wars, settlements, and resettlements that happen throughout the human history, I don't think we can talk about races as distinct and separate properties of human bodies. In the midst of such dynamic movements of humans, races are mingled. Nowadays, people can take a swab from their mouth and send it to companies who detect lineage or ancestor from a person's DNA. And we read examples of some interesting stories of people who previously assumed a pure racial lineage for themselves later learnt that their family tree or the ancestry is rich with more than 2 racial characteristics. I think pigeonholing people by how they appear at the outside is just another automatic trait we humans have to shed as we get developed more and more. After all, those external appearances of human bodies are only worldly appearances.
I can see the questions our dear friends ask at the chat box, and many of these are related to slavery. Before we finish our video, I'd like to say a few words about this. Yes, I agree with you all that slavery is wrong in the frame of conscience and human rights. However, slavery was a mechanism that has been utilized in earlier times to advance the mankind of the world in a fast manner. Indeed, we did advance and got developed. That's why this idea now sounds so bad, so wrong for us. Yes, now we know that slavery is wrong, yet we learnt this by this mechanism itself. In other words, we learnt that slavery is wrong as we lived lifetimes as slaves and also as slave traders. Let me explain what I mean. This mechanism is about the development of conscience and also the widening of comprehension. In other words, it existed to trigger the higher levels of the conscience in our spiritual development, and also, it existed to accelerate and elevate the psychical level of the bodies of those times. And please remember, it existed, not only in the United States of America but in many earlier cultures that considered human body as a commodity. Let's take the first perspective. The humans are forcibly taken from their birthplaces, and under harsh conditions, transferred to another geographical place. Yes, the material conditions were more advanced in those new places where they are forced to labor under harsher conditions. Yet as they toil and suffer in many lifetimes, they adjust to those new places and get advanced more than they could in their birthplaces. And at the same time, the suffering they endured leads to 2 outcomes. Slaves experience and understand the wrongness of the treatment they suffered, and they begin to add values related to justice and human rights into their reality as they pass to higher realities over their lifetimes. And the slave owners and traders live the consequences of their decisions, choices and actions over many lifetimes, even they have lifetimes as slaves or similar hardships. In short, all those communal sufferings and hardships humans bring to each other are a part of this mechanism that mixes and merges all races, adapts them to each other which otherwise would remain closed and unchanged, and that provide their faster progress.
Well, you mentioned slavery in earlier cultures, but maybe slavery still continues by taking new forms. Back then, it was about the power of the wealthy or mightier over the weak and ignorant peoples, but now, well, we become slaves to our mobile phones or social media. If we surrender our power to another's will, it is still slavery. And the slave owner's power is an abused power, corrupting. So both parties leave their own power, or the power of their essence being in the shadows. Only when we carry our power by taking its responsibility, we can get out of the shadows. And I think, today's humankind is feeling the labor pains of that looming birth into a higher reality. That is, appreciating humans because they are essence beings in biological bodies. Still, when compared to earlier times, yes, as you said, we had progressed. We now can talk about equality, about respecting humans' choices, religions, languages, races, and sexual orientations. In a way, all of us are working hard to finish our business that we left unfinished in past lifetimes. And this fast, crowded, active, dynamic web of connections and relations among individuals and communities pressure us to become faster and faster in our development because the harder tests and trials are waiting us. We will wake up, or we will wake up. None of us will be excluded. So, as the intensity and pressure of events increase, keeping our balance, remaining in our center, becomes more important than ever. The light of our essence being is always on, so even in the darkest hour, we can turn towards our own light, we can give an ear to our conscience. Yes, with these words, we wish you a good evening and a productive week. Hoping to see you next week.
Good evening, dear friends. See you next week.